become dependent on finding funding, because what you're going to do after you get your funding anyway, so you hire a bunch of people to do stuff, which is also a really bad idea, by the way, to hire a bunch of people at the same time. And then you're going to go and try to make this work. So your costs are going to be huge. You're going to burn through that. That's going to be your runway, right? I love the term, the runway. We got 18 months of runway. You have 18 months till it's over. So far in our ongoing Startup Takeoff series, we've touched on a number of myths around launching your business. But the funding myth, that you need funding to get your business off the ground, is so pervasive that we've opted to give it its own episode. Today, we'll cover the myths of early funding and help you understand if funding will help or hurt your business. Ladies and gentlemen, come on down. It's Startup Different, presented by Dave and Chris. Chris.
How you doing, Dave?
I'm good. Today we're talking about money.
I love money.
That's another good LinkedIn tagline. What was the other one? You were born to be acquired, and now I love money. I love money.
Yeah. I've heard it's pretty good.
It's pretty okay. Yeah, I wore a green shirt today just to kind of, it's the color of money. I don't know. I kind of blend in with my background a little bit, so hopefully that works out. But anyway, it's a real background. It's not like I won't get like a Zoom one where I just like get absorbed into it or something like that.
It's like green screen shirt. Nice.
Basically. So today we're talking about, so specifically, what kind of money are we talking about? Well, we are talking about funding. And so we talked, and specifically early funding. So your seed level, Series A, maybe B, depending on your business and where it's going, all that kind of stuff. But we want to talk about this because this is a biggie. And this is one of those things that is like maybe the most pervasive. I don't call it like, it's not that it exists. Like it's obviously it exists, but the myth is like how good it is actually for your business. And the assumption obviously is that it's a good thing. Otherwise, so many businesses wouldn't be trying to get it or have it. But I think it's way more complicated. And this is definitely one of those things that weighs on you, especially with your early business where you're like, okay, I want to feel more legitimate. I want a legitimate business. I want to be able to say to my friends, I got a bunch of money for my idea. Therefore, it's a good idea. And it's scary. That's all I'm going to say. It's one of those things where it can actually be way worse for you, like way worse. It could even kill your business. And that's what we want to get at today. It's so innately tied to the concept, funding that is, early funding is so innately tied to the concept of starting a business that people will actually be very skeptical of you if you don't have it or aren't trying to pursue it. Like I remember that. Do you remember feeling some of that in the early days?
Absolutely. I can remember other startups would say weird things like, they got $1 million in funding and they gave up 20%. So they're already a $5 million business, but they have zero sales and zero customers.
Yeah.
And
valuations,
zero anything. Yeah, I know.
That's a whole other episode if we wanted to go down that road.
But you want to feel legit, you go around and tell people stuff like that. We're a $5 million business because we raised $1 million and only gave away 20%. It just doesn't make any sense. But
we're going to get into this, but it's the valuations part is definitely really bizarre. And it's interesting too, because it's not so much that bootstrapping, so that is not getting venture capital funding or, seed level investment or whatever. It's not that it has a bad rap. I actually think a lot of people are super impressed when, I guess this is a little bit self-serving in retrospect, but they're very impressed when you say, we bootstrapped our business. They go, wow. It's almost like if that's not even possible. Like, I can't believe you pulled that off.
Yeah, when we were acquired, we had no debt. We had just you and I on the cap table. Like it was, and our lawyers' accounts were like, huh?
Yeah. I remember the first question from TCV was like, yeah, so, what debt do you have? I'm like, none.
Yeah.
What? Or like very little. I think maybe the office, the office space or whatever. No, we didn't even have it. I made this mistake before in another episode. We didn't even have that. It's fine. So I think what's interesting is, so it's not that bootstrapping is a bad rap. Actually, bootstrapping is like really almost admired. It's that like the funding, like getting the funding is perceived as a marker of legitimacy and business model, validation. but it's not. It's straight up, it's not. It's really, really not. It is in a way. Yeah, like somebody looked at these numbers, but it's so much more complicated than that. And that's really what we want to get at here today. And actually, before I do, I'll tell a really quick story. I remember it was so pervasive that I would go on sales calls. And this is probably when we were doing, I don't know, maybe 1 million, maybe 2 million, annually recurring, very stable revenue. Like we had our churn rate was like, I think we would lose like logo churn. I think we would lose maybe 1% per year, maybe less. Some years it would have been almost non-existent. So we were very stable, and they come on the call and they say, okay, well, how much venture capital funding do you have? I would say none. And some of them would go, well, that's weird. What are you not telling me about the business? It's almost like we had a skeleton in the closet. And I think those who were a bit more savvy were like, well, that's a good thing, because that means they're not beholden to like the investor objectives, but instead can really drive the direction of the business. Like the people who kind of like were more entrepreneurial, kind of, I think, maybe I want to believe, maybe this is like revisionist history here, but I felt like they understood that we had more control when we didn't have funding. But there were definitely people who were maybe further away from entrepreneurship who just watched Shark Tank, and they're like, oh, well, if you don't have funding, you're not really that legit. You're not really validated.
Yeah. Part of it too, though, Dave, was like, what were we going to do with the money anyway? Like, I was writing the code, you were out there selling it. Why did we need a whole bunch?
And actually, to be fair too, we did have our close brushes with thinking that, hey, maybe we could use, a couple $100,000, $1 million or whatever. And we're going to get to this in a second, but it was a lot of work to do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and sell more customers.
And it wasn't easier. It wasn't like inexpensive money. And we'll get to that.
We'll get to that. Okay. We're so excited about this. I can tell we're already like jumping ahead.
All right, let's dive in. Then. All right, let's go.
Let's set the table. Okay. So I really wanted to understand if funding actually helps. Now, I just want to be clear here. I'm not saying something causal. I'm not saying that, like, I don't have data that says like, because you get funding, you will fail. It's not quite like that. It's more nuanced. Like it just changes your business. So, but let's look at the big data. So go into the big board. According to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, 70%, 70 of startups fail in years 2 to 5. Okay, so I'm just gonna say right now, starting a business is a hard thing to do.
Yeah,
this data is kind of sobering. For those of you listening today, I want you to know that I believe in you. You are an entrepreneur. Going back to the first episode of this series, like, you can do this, but the odds, they're not great. But you can do it. You can do it by focusing on your business and doing things differently, like we're sort of describing. There's another sobering one. 80% of tech and e-commerce startups fail. Oof. Oof. Shout out to Wendy from our team. She was really good at the oof at the right time. Oof. And everybody started doing it after a while. And then namely, and this is one I really wanted to hit, is that 75% of venture-backed startups fail. Okay. This is all data that we can provide to you. If you care, you can just trust me because I'm a good guy, whatever. And some of this is semantics as well. So like, failure can be defined as everything from missing targets set up by investors to like selling everything, like pulling the copper wire out of the wall, and and shutting the lights off. Remember that Simpsons episode? You remember that? Where they're pulling they're pulling the copper wire out of the wall, and the toilet paper in the bathroom was shares of the company, of the startup.
Yeah.
But still, so like the pure data picture here is one where funding marginally helps, if at all. Okay. So that's the thing I want to understand. And I also want to set one more very important criteria here. And Chris, I promise I'll let you say something too. But we don't want to we hate venture capital. There are lots of incredible professionals, people way smarter than me, and probably Chris.
Definitely smarter than me.
And maybe we'll get some on the show, next season. I'd love to get Gal on the show, but and they're intelligent people, and they're making decisions, based on different objectives. But and funding is also necessary in some cases for capital intensive businesses. So think about like hardware products, or you got a big inventory, that kind of thing. And then lastly is that funding can be helpful potentially later in your business. So once you're established, once you're in the market, you're moving millions of dollars, you're shipping product, you're more established, you have brand equity, But early money, paradoxically, is like can actually cause the collapse of your startup as opposed to actually fueling its growth, as opposed to hitting that stereotypical hockey stick curve.
Dave, I just noticed there's a common thread across all those stats of companies that fail.
What's that?
Is that those founders don't listen to the Startup Different podcast.
Jesus, he's absolutely right. I mean, to be fair, we don't actually know that. They could.
Yeah, I don't have any data to support that, but I assume.
If you're in that list, can you give us a call now? This is our first call ever because this is not a call-in show. I think you're right. I think you're onto something there, Chris. But so, okay. So what gives? We have these stats. Everybody is running towards funding as a way of trying to validate their business model. But why does it actually hurt more? So we thought of a few different ways. And Chris, I'm gonna toss these balls up in the air and you go grab them. But so the first is that you're new to the market. Okay, so if you're getting like really, really early funding, you've got very marginal revenue, a couple $100K or something like that. You don't know the market yet, but to get the venture capital, to get the money, you'll be making a ton of promises based on your loose understanding of that market and what it needs. So like you're making a huge bet, really, really early.
Yeah, you're probably telling your investors, "Oh, I've got the way that we can sell this thing." And investors don't really like it when you're really wrong, and they're like they don't want you to come back and say, "Oh yeah, that idea that I used to convince you to give me all that money, yeah, it's total garbage. We got to do a totally different thing." And that's going to be a really great conversation you're going to have with your investors.
Right? Yeah, and it's gonna go terribly. And I think also like it's a lot of. We're gonna get into this in a second too, but I think the long and short of it is like sometimes you just need time. You just need time to understand the market and understand its needs and how your product fits in it and how the market will change once you start getting into that market. If you're making big bucks, you can bet that you're going to see more competitors start showing up. Like if this is actually a good idea, and like that's going to affect what you can charge, which affects the business case that you made to your investor. So like there's so much to this that it's scary, and we'll talk more about that sort of moment in time factor in just a second. The second piece I wanted to really hit on here is that finding funding is a full-time job. It shouldn't be a core competency of your business, but it becomes one because in this weird way, you become dependent on that money, right? You become dependent on finding funding because what you're going to do after you get your funding anyway, so you hire a bunch of people to do stuff, which is also a really bad idea, by the way, to hire a bunch of people at the same time. And then you're going to go and try to make this work. So your costs are going to be huge. You're going to burn through that. That's going to be your runway, right? I love the term, the runway. We got 18 months of runway. You have 18 months till it's over. Till you presumably you roll off the runway and explode. Like like what are we talking about? So I guess you as an early founder must be focused on in the business priorities, like getting more sales, building your product, delivering exceptional customer service. Focusing on funding is a path to failure.
Yeah, there's kind of like a double whammy. I think if you can, instead of spending all that time trying to get funding will hopefully, if you're successful, will generate money for you. But if you go out and you get customers, if you go out and spend that same time pitching to customers, signing up customers, you get two things. You get money from the actual customers, which you don't have to give away equity for.
Yep.
But you also start to get things like a client base, which means like references and, credibility in the market and all those other things. So you really have to look at the time you're spending and say, like, hey, it might be better to spend that, next week trying to get client number one rather than trying to get investor number one. Yeah. So that our 2 cents is, obviously we're a little bit biased on this.
Yeah, whatever. You're listening to Startup Different, brought to you by Dave and Chris, the Bootstrapping founders. So the other thing I wanted to mention there too, though, on the actual pursuit of the money, finding the funding, I found kind of a cool stat, which is so basically the whole thing can be like a scary, huge waste of time. So the average VC firm actually receives over or approximately 1,000 applications, for funding per year. There's a lot of VC firms out there too. Like that's actually crazy. It's entirely possible that you could be out there wasting your time trying to convince investors while the business is floundering because you're so focused on getting that money. It's
or a
crazy.
competitor figured it out already and they're eating you alive in the market. And you don't even know. Yeah.
Like I find these things that are, I'm choking on my own rage here. I find that I find it crazy that early founders are working so hard on these on the business things. You need to be in it for a long time till you can turn around and justifiably pursue funding. Quite frankly. But it's probably okay. Let's back out here for a second. I got to cool off. I'm gonna let you speak for a second. Okay, so it's probably the most expensive form of money. Chris, what do we mean by that?
Yeah, so we actually kind of talked about this when we were originally starting as well. You're giving away equity. That is like the most expensive form of capital you could potentially get. You're giving away a percentage of your business. You could also just ask yourself, hey, can I go to the bank and get a loan and pay that interest rate and then not give away equity? Like, are there other ways I can get funding without having to give away equity? I think you need to factor that into your plans because you really like giving away a big chunk of your business. You're all of a sudden inviting more people to the party, and you're going to have to manage those people. Like if you have investors, you're going to have calls with them. You're going to have to let them know how your business is doing. It's going to be a lot of time that you're going to commit to that. So you really have to factor all these things in. So not even just like the literal cost of capital in dollars, but the cost of capital in your time. The founder's time is so valuable, and you really need to be spending that time in front of customers.
You think about the longer term play on that too. So you might be like, well, I want to get funding so that I can have $100 million business. Okay. So you go out and you've done multiple rounds of capital. What is your actual equity position by the end of that? So let's say you have 15% as a founder by the time you're at, I don't know, Series D or whatever series letter you want. You're going to end up in a position where you sell that business for $100 million and you get 15.
Yeah.
That sucks.
I was talking to a founder not that long ago, and the founder said to me, I'd rather have a small piece of something big rather than a big piece of something small.
No.
And no, the feeling that I have is I like if I was an investor, I want the founder to have a big piece of a big thing.
Obviously,
you know what I mean? Like I think that, this is really what it comes down to is, you dilute yourself as a founder by having all these other investors. And those investors are very passive. They probably don't know your market. Like all those, like that baggage that comes along with it is really not worthwhile. So that's where we're
what do you want more? Do you want 15% of $100 million business or 50% of a $40 million business?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that doesn't make any sense. And think of the stress of a $100 million business, like the complexity by the time you get there. Oof, guys, equity is sacred. Guys and gals, equity is sacred.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
Don't give it away easy.
Don't give that away.
Yeah. Definitely not to your brother.
Back off.
All right.
Get your own sandwich. I think the last thing I'll say on like the cost of money is, for your finance 101 folks out there, there's something called the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital. And if you actually if you really work this out and you figure out how expensive that money is that you're getting from an investor, that formula is humongous, but it will give you the answer that it is definitely the most expensive form of money. But so the other thing that we thought was kind of interesting is that your pitch is also a moment in time that your competitors can exploit. And this was us. Okay, so we loved it. So there was kind of a few categories of competitors. You have your trunk slammers, and driving around in the Buick or the Cadillac, whatever. They got all the products in the trunk. They're a regional sales guy. That's fine. And you can beat them most of the time, but every once in a while they know somebody or whatever. Then you got your venture capital funded businesses, which we're going to get at here in a second. Then you got your really big guys who are maybe publicly traded or whatever. But those venture capital firms, you can really back out the promises that company made. And to the extent that, because they're going to do a big announcement. We just got $30 million to expand into the public safety market and
disrupt the public safety market.
And once you get a start, once you're in the market, you're going to start hearing their prices anyway. But once you connect the dots with that and what they've raised, then you can be like, well, they're probably saying to their investor, we're going to get $30,000 a customer per year. So then naturally we were like, okay, we'll do it for 25. You know what I mean? Because we don't have that problem as being bootstrapped. We could decide, short of obviously covering our costs, outside of that, we could charge whatever the heck we wanted. So it's one of those things where I actually would suggest you're more competitively vulnerable if you get funding, and not to mention all the debt also that you're taking on. Like you just can't. We could wait you out. We could do a war of endurance against you, and we would win every time.
What was the stat from the beginning? 70% failed within, 2 to 5 years?
Yeah.
So you wait so they've already been up and running for 3 years. You might only have to wait another 2 years and then they're gone. And that happened in our industry. Totally. We had like a dozen competitors. Yep. And then about 3 years later, there was like 3 left, you know, and then we were acquired. It was down to like 2, so you just almost, you just wait them out.
Yeah. 2 more things I want to get on this last piece. I'm worried that we're verging on a rant, but I just wanted to get this out there. And I mean this in the right way to the investors out there, but here's a heads up for the founders. Your investors can suck. Okay. So there's 2 parts to that. They can just literally be tough to work with, which is one element. And that's, on a person to person basis. But the second thing is kind of this like fundamental misalignment. So they're going to have like generic strategies for growing your business, sort of the growth at all costs strategy, because they're looking at a 5-year probably exit. That's probably as long as they're willing to tolerate. You might get a good investor who's like, I'm in this for the long game. That's great. Okay. If that's what you're looking for, that aligns well. Realistically, you probably aren't getting that. You're getting that 5-year window, and they're going to give you strategies that worked for some startups that they had and that failed for others. And sometimes your market, which you definitely understand, you might be saying, look, I just need more time to get this going. And they don't have patience for that. That's the one thing that they're not going to be able to tolerate. So this misalignment can cause really good business ideas to go really heavily in debt. And then after about 4 or 5 years, right into the ground.
I think that more time comment was us, Dave. Like our product was ahead of its time in the market. People weren't ready for it. Mm-hmm. And then there was a moment when it was its time and it took off, and it wasn't so much what we were doing. It was more just, expectations in the market, behavior, customer behavior, the way people were working, everybody was using cell phones all of a sudden, and it was just an obvious thing. And I don't know when that flipped exactly, but all of a sudden our business got way easier at that
2017.
point. So, yeah.
I think when I think once we had there were a certain number of competitors and a certain number of us, and we had all had a reasonable amount of success, that sort of normalized the conversation around these like mobile safety apps from like an abstract, like, do we need this, to like, which one are we going to get?
Yeah. So. Yeah, that was great when the conversation shifted to that rather than, are we going to get a mobile safety
This is awesome.
Yeah. Let's line them up and see who's best. Yeah.
The last thing was, and I wanted to get to this too, because I'm a big culture HR guy at times, which is that funding alters your company culture. It does. Your employees, you're going to say stuff to your employees. Well, we just got to hit this arbitrary number, and then we can make payroll, next month or whatever. Like, it's weird. We were around these companies in Bright Lane and the other co-working spaces that we were in. It's a really different culture vibe, and I don't think it's one that fosters innovation. I think it's one that fosters stress and anxiety, and so for us, it was just like why bother? Like, what? This isn't a good thing. This isn't what we want our staff thinking about. We want them focused on the business. And you got this funding conversation kind of ongoing, or the investors are walking in. You can see the founder just shaking. I remember you could always tell when the investors were coming, for any given company at Brightly, because the founders were just freaking out. And so it's just sort of one of those things too, that that effect on your culture cannot be understated. So what do you want instead, Chris? What do we want instead of all this anxiety? What do we want to focus on?
Profit, right?
Money.
Yeah.
Like money that
real
you can get
money
from customers.
Yeah.
Customer-driven funding.
Yeah, revolutionary idea. Who's funding your business? Our customers. Wow.
Wow. So like early profit is different. Be different. That's actually what investors want anyway. That's the market telling you that you're right and that you're moving in the right direction at the right pace. That's what we want to get to. And also bootstrapping works. There's this whole thing like, again, this admiration, like how did you pull it off? Like most businesses are actually bootstrapped. So this is a little bit different, but when you like zoom out to the entire economy, 78% of businesses aren't funded by venture capital. And some of them are big companies. So the following companies are all bootstrapped and reached billions of dollars. Shopify, MailChimp, GoPro, Vuori, Basecamp, whatever. These are like, that's just a tip of the iceberg. Like you can do this. You don't need the funding. And especially if you're in software, for the love of God. Like if you, I just like, again, hardware. Okay. I get it. You like pieces and circuit boards and manufacturing.
Even
whatever.
Still though, the costs
I still think you could probably figure it out just for what it's worth. But for software, what are you doing to yourself? We used to joke that it's like selling air because there's no shipping, there's no warehouse, there's no like you send it to them over the internet.
Yeah. Really low marginal cost, a little bit more, cloud hosting or something like that, but that was about it.
So our advice is go out there, find customers. For a while, you're going to make a modest living. Invest the rest in the business. That's fine. Investors want that too. It's also a nice looking thing for investors. I see that you're serious about the business. It's the short-term pain, long-term gain approach to starting your business. Chris and I waited 4 years to increase our personal income. So, that's just what you got to do. But you know what? The catch to all this and kind of rounding this all out is that you're going to feel the pressure. You're going to feel the skepticism from people that think that you need funding. Remember, the haters will always hate. Even if you go out there and get 2 million in funding, the haters will say some bullshit like, oh, only 2 million? I know a guy who raised 3 million, blah, 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 or some other trash. Don't pursue validation in your peers. Pursue validation in the market.
Well said, Dave.
Thank you. I am very opinionated on this subject. Okay, let's wrap it all up. Early funding doesn't guarantee your business success or even effectively validate your business model. It just doesn't. It comes with crazy strings attached, both personally and for your startup. Focus instead on early profit and always, as always, ignore the haters.
Right on.
Okay, I'm gonna go lie down or something. I
have a nap.
Need to chill out. Maybe too much coffee. I'm not really sure, but
serenity now. Serenity
now. Insanity later. Thanks so much, folks, for joining us today. That was this episode of the series on Startup Takeoff. Next week, we will be covering fighting employment remorse, which is going to be a fun one. We hope you enjoy it. And until then, please rate the pod, follow us on social, and we will see you next week. Thanks for joining us. If you like what you heard, subscribe to and rate Startup Different in your favorite podcast app. If you want to see our radio faces, check us out on YouTube at Startup Different and look us up on social. We're probably there if you are. And lastly, do you want to feature your startup on the show? Reach out via our website, startupdifferent.com. See you next time.